In this gripping story about racism in America, Charlie Mason, a successful black lawyer, faces an entitled racist man at a coffee shop who dismisses him based on his appearance. The man's condescending attitude and privilege are on full display as he belittles Charlie, assuming his status allows him to disrespect others. The confrontation quickly escalates, revealing deep systemic racism, as the man uses his wealth and power to try to silence Charlie. This emotional clash highlights the everyday prejudices that people of color face and the injustice that continues to shape their lives. In the heart of downtown, nestled between a bakery with a hand-painted sign and a record store that had been around longer than anyone could remember, sat a small, unassuming coffee shop called Java and Jams. The place wasn't on anyone's must-visit list, but that was precisely why it was Charlie Mason's favorite spot in the city. Here, amidst the aroma of freshly ground beans and the soft hum of music playing overhead, Charlie could sit in peace without the eyes of the world upon him. Charlie Mason was used to being seen. He was a lawyer, one of the youngest and most successful in the country, a black man who had earned his place at the top of an industry not always welcoming to people who looked like him. But in Java and Jams, no one recognized him. No one knew about the millions he managed, the high-profile cases he won, or the countless charities he supported. Here, he was just another customer, a man who preferred his coffee dark and his mornings quiet. This morning was no different. He stood at the counter, casually browsing the menu, as a barista with a chipped nose ring greeted him with a lazy smile. Her name tag read Emma, though Charlie hadn't bothered to learn her name. He'd been coming to this shop for years and never had to introduce himself. In this space, he wasn't Charlie Mason, the attorney who could change the course of an entire city's criminal justice system with a single case. He was just another face in the crowd, which suited him just fine. "I'll take the usual," Charlie said, his deep voice steady, but warm. Emma nodded as she began preparing the coffee. Charlie leaned against the counter, hands buried in the pockets of his jacket. The quiet of the shop wrapped around him like a blanket. He could hear the faint clink of mugs and the sound of someone else entering, but he didn't turn to look. He was used to people walking in and out, all in their own worlds. But then, he heard a voice that stood out, a voice with a certain sharpness to it. "Excuse me, I need to speak to the manager." Charlie glanced over his shoulder, his attention now captured. The man who had spoken wasn't imposing at first glance. A middle-aged man, maybe in his early 40s, wearing a well-worn leather jacket and a look that suggested he didn't belong in this part of town. His clothes were clearly expensive but worn, an air of someone who was trying to blend in but still couldn't quite make it. The kind of man Charlie had learned to spot a mile away. The man's demeanor, however, was different. There was something about the way he held himself, demanding, expectant, like his presence should command attention. Emma, without missing a beat, turned to the man and replied in the same flat tone, "I'll go get him." Charlie took another sip of his coffee, watching as the man waited. He could feel the man's gaze shift over him, but Charlie didn't let it linger. His eyes never wavered from the barista, who was busy with the coffee grinder, completely oblivious to the tension in the air. It wasn't unusual for people to come in with requests or complaints, but this man's energy was different. Something in the way he carried himself said that he wasn't just here for a coffee or to resolve a small issue. There was an undercurrent, an edge to his presence that Charlie didn't quite trust. Charlie had learned a lot over the years, lessons from his upbringing, from his time at law school, from the people who had tried to tell him he didn't belong in spaces like this one. And yet, here he was, a black man, holding the reins of one of the city's most influential law firms, surrounded by wealth and power he'd fought tooth and nail to acquire. But at the end of the day, even with all his success, Charlie knew how it felt to be overlooked, dismissed, or even disregarded. That was the reality of being black in a world that didn't always make space for people like him. Charlie shifted in his seat, watching the stranger's movements carefully. His mind was already turning over the situation, analyzing it with the sharpness he'd honed in the courtroom. The man was about to get what he wanted, whether the barista was interested in helping him or not. Charlie could feel the inevitable play-out in his head. How the man would speak over Emma, how he would demand more than his fair share, and how the interaction would end with the man feeling justified. As the manager, a slight man in a button-up shirt, approached, Charlie's gaze narrowed. He saw the subtle change in the man's posture, the way his shoulders stiffened as he addressed the stranger. He recognized that look. It was the same look that people had when they were about to accommodate someone, when they felt the need to prove their worth by bending over backward for someone who, by all measures, didn't deserve it. The tension in the air grew thicker as the two exchanged brief words. The stranger's voice rose sharply, demanding to speak to the owner, the staff, anyone who could fix whatever had gone wrong in his day. The manager, polite but clearly over it, was already nodding along. Charlie could feel the gears of the situation shifting in a way that made his jaw tighten. The stranger wasn't just looking for a fix, he was looking for control. Charlie shifted in his seat, taking another sip of his coffee, his fingers lightly tapping the edge of the mug. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible gesture. A habit when something was bothering him. He wasn't in the mood for confrontation. It wasn't his style, but he also wasn't going to ignore what he was witnessing. The subtle condescension in the man's tone, the way he leaned forward, the way he assumed power over the entire room. It was all too familiar. As the manager nodded and returned to the back room, the stranger glanced around, his eyes flicking over the other customers. For a moment, his gaze met Charlie's. There was no recognition, no understanding. Just a brief moment where Charlie's presence registered, before the man returned to scanning the room with a look of barely concealed disdain. The moment was fleeting, but it spoke volumes to Charlie. He had been in these situations before, the ones where his very presence was questioned, where his power and influence didn't seem to count because of the color of his skin. The ones where people like this man, privileged, entitled, and unaware, walked in and assumed they had the right to make demands, simply because of who they were. Charlie finished his coffee slowly. He wasn't angry, not yet. But the more he thought about it, the more the situation gnawed at him. He had spent his entire life proving his worth, battling prejudice, facing the unspoken biases that came with being a black man in spaces that weren't built for him. Now, as the stranger continued to escalate his demands to the manager, Charlie realized he couldn't just sit back and watch anymore. This wasn't about him being a successful lawyer or powerful businessman. This was about something much more fundamental, the dignity of every person in this room. The stranger's sense of superiority was a mirror of the systemic issues that permeated every corner of society. And Charlie knew it. He'd seen it before, fought against it, and had watched others succumb to it. Charlie leaned back in his seat, watching. His decision was made. He wouldn't let this pass without saying something. Not today. Charlie Mason sat back in his seat, his fingers drumming lightly against his coffee cup, his thoughts sharpening. The stranger at the counter was growing increasingly agitated, and Charlie knew exactly what was happening. The man was demanding, pushing for a level of service and attention that clearly wasn't given to others, based solely on his appearance. Charlie could see it in the way the man held himself, entitled, demanding, with an edge of impatience and frustration that wasn't aimed at any real issue, but simply because things weren't going his way. The assumption that others would cater to his every whim without question, that their status, color, or identity meant nothing, was written all over him. Charlie watched, feeling his own pulse quicken as the man's voice rose again. He spoke with a finality that suggested the manager was about to give in, and he would get his way. The man hadn't even paused to consider that the cafe staff was under no obligation to accommodate his requests, just because he didn't like the seating arrangement. In fact, Charlie had been here often enough to know that this cafe prided itself on maintaining a certain laid-back ambiance, where patrons were encouraged to enjoy their time and choose where to sit without any rigid expectations. And yet, there it was. This quiet, unspoken, insidious prejudice that Charlie had seen far too many times. The man assumed that because of his appearance, his tone, his wealth, or perhaps his race, he would get what he wanted without question. Charlie's jaw tightened, but his response was measured. He had spent his life learning to navigate these kinds of situations, the kind where subtle power dynamics played out under the surface. The first instinct was to call it out, to tell the man his behavior was unacceptable, to fight back with every ounce of indignation he felt. But that would only feed the flames of hostility. Instead, Charlie chose the route of patience. He wasn't here to escalate the situation, not yet. He needed to understand what this man, and the system that empowered him, wanted from him. As the man continued to argue with the manager, Emma, the barista who had taken Charlie's order, caught his gaze. Her lips twisted slightly, her eyes flickering in his direction, as though silently acknowledging what was happening. It wasn't the first time Charlie had seen it. In a place like this, where the majority of the regular patrons were affluent and predominantly white, he often felt the weight of being seen, but not truly acknowledged. It wasn't blatant discrimination. It wasn't the kind of racism that shouted, but rather the kind that whispered, that wrapped itself around moments like these, quiet, insidious, and impossible to prove. Charlie glanced down at his clothes, a well-tailored jacket, a pair of shoes that spoke of wealth but didn't scream it. His appearance didn't scream for attention, it was understated, sophisticated. Still, the assumption was always the same. People often treated him like he didn't belong, like he was either too much or too little for spaces like this, and it wasn't just happening here. It was a daily occurrence, a constant push and pull between wanting to be left alone and the need to prove, again and again, that he belonged. Charlie had gotten used to it. He had learned to live with it, but that didn't make it any less frustrating. He turned his attention back to the exchange. The man was now loudly demanding the manager give him something else. An upgrade, a guarantee of top-tier service, a special consideration that Charlie knew had nothing to do with the actual quality of the coffee. This was about power, about a man using his influence to get what he wanted without earning it, without even acknowledging that everyone else had to follow the same rules. Charlie caught a brief glance of the man's face, his features hardened in a way that made his intent clear. It wasn't just about getting what he wanted. It was about making sure that everyone in this cafe knew who he was, and that his word was final. Charlie remained calm, but internally, he was seething. He could see where this was headed. Emma, the barista, looked conflicted, but didn't dare to speak up. Charlie had watched enough of these situations unfold to know that in the face of an authoritative figure, even in a low-stakes moment like this, the power dynamics could easily become skewed. The staff would back off, they'd apologize, even if they didn't mean it, just to avoid conflict. And that's exactly what was happening now. The manager was bowing to the man's demands, offering a complicit smile. As he accommodated the unreasonable request, Charlie could hear the manager's voice. Low, apologetic, almost deferential. "You're absolutely right, sir," the manager said. "We'll take care of that right away." Charlie's eyes narrowed, and his fingers tightened around his coffee cup. This wasn't just about a man getting preferential treatment. It was a display of unchecked power. It was a demonstration of a system that allowed people to get away with behavior like this, even in spaces that were supposed to be equal, where everyone was supposedly treated with the same respect. As Charlie sat there, absorbing the scene before him, he could feel the familiar wave of frustration rising. The truth was undeniable. The man wasn't just getting special treatment because of his money or his loud demands. He was getting special treatment because of something far deeper. The assumption that his wealth, his race, and his power would shield him from any scrutiny or challenge, that he could manipulate the system and never be called out, was clear. Charlie had faced it before. The sharp stares, the conversations that faltered when he entered a room, the suspicion in someone's eyes as they tried to place him in their mental hierarchy. He had been mistaken for the help at high-profile events. He had been looked down upon in boardrooms despite his success. It was the story of his life, woven into the fabric of every encounter. The truth settled in him, and for a moment, Charlie was reminded of the sting that never really went away. He was both privileged and underprivileged, and it didn't matter how much power he amassed or how many people he helped. He was still subject to the same biases that plagued everyone who looked like him. The man in the leather jacket received his request with a satisfied smirk. The manager, like clockwork, apologized once more. But Charlie's patience was wearing thin. His body tensed, and his mind began to whirl with all the ways this moment was simply another iteration of the story he had seen play out too many times. Charlie stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor as he moved toward the counter. The man in the leather jacket didn't notice him at first, his attention fixed on the manager, who was still issuing apologies and promises of future upgrades. "Excuse me," Charlie said, his voice cutting through the haze of the interaction. The man's head snapped toward him, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if wondering who dared interrupt his moment of power. "I couldn't help but overhear," Charlie continued, his tone calm but firm. "But it seems that your request for special treatment is being handled in a way that's different from how everyone else is treated. Could you clarify why that is?" The man blinked, clearly taken aback by the directness. Charlie's posture was straight, his expression unreadable. He had learned long ago that people like this man, who relied on their privilege, often didn't expect to be challenged in such a straightforward way. They were used to people bowing to their demands, not standing up to them. "Who are you?" The man's voice had a slight edge to it, but Charlie didn't flinch. "I'm someone who believes that everyone, no matter their background or appearance, should be treated equally," Charlie said simply. "I was under the impression that this cafe treats all customers with the same respect, but it seems that isn't the case. I thought I should let you know." The manager looked nervous, but Charlie didn't look away. He wasn't here to make a scene. He was here to remind the man that there were consequences for wielding power unjustly. He was here to make a statement, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin. The man's face reddened, his jaw clenching, as he seemed to weigh his next words carefully. He wasn't used to being challenged, but Charlie had done what he had set out to do. He had introduced doubt into the man's mind, forcing him to confront his behavior, if only for a moment. Charlie stood his ground, unyielding. He knew this wouldn't be the last time he had to face this kind of injustice. But today, he had taken the first step toward challenging it. The coffee shop had grown quieter now, the earlier buzz of activity replaced by a tense silence. Charlie stood still, facing the man in the leather jacket, who was slowly processing the interruption. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hiss of the espresso machine behind the counter and the shuffle of the manager as he nervously avoided eye contact. The man's features tightened as he slowly took in Charlie's words, his pride resisting the challenge. But there was something in Charlie's calm resolve that made the man pause. Charlie wasn't raising his voice or making a scene. He was simply standing there, making it clear that the man's behavior wasn't going to go unchecked. "I'm just making sure we're all on the same page here," Charlie said, his voice as steady as ever. Though beneath the calm surface, the weight of the moment was building. "Everyone deserves respect, but it seems like you've decided that's not the case today." The man's lips tightened into a thin line. He had the look of someone used to getting his way, someone who wasn't accustomed to having his sense of entitlement questioned. He looked around, as if weighing his options, then leaned forward, his voice low but biting. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as he took a step closer to Charlie. His posture was aggressive now, but Charlie didn't move. He had been here before, on the receiving end of that exact look, the one that said, "I am above you, and I will remind you of it." Charlie's eyes remained steady. "Does it matter who you are?" he asked, his tone sharp. "What matters is how you treat others, and frankly, you've shown a complete lack of respect." The words hung in the air. The man's face flushed with a mixture of anger and surprise, as if Charlie had dared to turn the tables on him in a way he couldn't comprehend. For a moment, the room was still, all eyes on the two men locked in this silent standoff. Charlie could feel the manager's unease at his back. The barista, Emma, avoided his gaze. He wasn't sure if she was relieved that someone was standing up to the entitled man, or if she was simply scared of the consequences that would follow. The tension in the coffee shop escalated quickly, the calm of the morning shattered by the unspoken understanding that this exchange wasn't going to end quietly. Charlie had always known that the subtle ways racism and bias manifested in everyday interactions weren't always easy to pinpoint. But in moments like these, it wasn't just about the words that were said, it was about the culture of entitlement that allowed those words to even be spoken. The man in the leather jacket felt he had every right to demand more, not because of anything he had done to deserve it, but because of who he thought he was. The man's jaw clenched as he stared Charlie down. "You think you can talk to me like that?" he growled, the edge of his voice showing that the self-restraint was slipping. "You don't know who I am. I don't have time for this nonsense." Charlie's stomach tightened. His initial instinct had been to disengage, to walk away, to not let the man's actions consume him. But something had shifted. Something inside him snapped. This wasn't just about a disrespectful customer or an entitled man. This was bigger. It was about a culture that allowed people like this man to feel superior. based on assumptions that had been ingrained in society for years. Charlie stood up straighter, his posture commanding. "I don't care who you are," he said, his voice rising now, cutting through the tension. "But I will make sure you understand that no one here is beneath you, not me, not anyone." The man's face reddened, but his reaction wasn't what Charlie expected. Instead of getting more aggressive, he seemed to retreat a step, deflated for a moment. Charlie could see the flicker of uncertainty in the man's eyes, a crack in the armor. But just as quickly, the moment passed. The man straightened up, eyes flashing with fury. "You're making a huge mistake," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You'll regret this. People like you, people who think they can challenge me, always end up on the losing side. Just remember that." Charlie's pulse was racing now. His mind was working in overdrive, assessing the situation. He had been here before. He had faced the scrutiny of the boardrooms, the dismissals in courtrooms, the casual racism that pervaded every space he had entered. But this felt different. The stakes were higher. This wasn't just a power struggle, it was an opportunity to make a statement. Charlie exhaled slowly. He had already made his choice. The man's threat meant nothing to him. His actions were a reflection of something much deeper, something that couldn't be fixed in a single interaction. But Charlie knew that if he backed down now, nothing would change. He wasn't just fighting for respect in this coffee shop. He was fighting for every single moment, when people like him were made to feel small, pushed aside, or denied basic dignity. Before he could respond, the door to the shop swung open again, and the manager appeared in the doorway, visibly shaken. Mr. Mason?" the manager said, his voice unsteady. "There's a police officer outside. He says he's here for you." Charlie's heart skipped a beat. For me, the words hung in the air like a dark omen. He didn't need to be told twice what was happening. The man had clearly called for backup. It was a tactic Charlie had seen before. Use your influence, use your connections, to push someone back into their place. Charlie's eyes flickered to the door, his mind racing. The situation was escalating quickly, and now he was at the center of it. This wasn't just about a man making demands at a coffee shop. It was about a system that allowed people like him to use their power and privilege to intimidate and suppress others, to make sure that their word was final, and that no one dared to question them. The manager looked at him with an apologetic glance, but Charlie held his ground. "It's fine," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable edge. "I'm sure the officer is just here to check in on things." He stood up slowly, aware of the eyes on him. The barista, Emma, glanced nervously between Charlie and the manager. The man in the leather jacket stood off to the side, his arms crossed, as though he were satisfied with how things were unfolding. Charlie took a deep breath as he walked toward the door, his footsteps steady and deliberate. He had no idea what awaited him outside, but he wasn't about to be intimidated. He had faced far worse, had risen from far more insurmountable odds, and he would not let this moment become another mark against his dignity. As he stepped out onto the sidewalk, the cold morning air hit him, snapping him to attention. A police officer stood by a patrol car, her arms crossed and her gaze fixed on him. She didn't look threatening, but the very presence of the police was a reminder of how deeply entrenched the system of power really was. "Mr. Mason?" the officer asked, her voice curt. "You're causing a disturbance inside. We've had a complaint." Charlie didn't flinch. "A complaint?" he asked, his voice controlled but sharp. "I'm simply defending my right to be treated with respect, something that, apparently, the other customer doesn't understand." The officer's eyes flickered slightly. She wasn't buying the narrative, but she wasn't acting aggressively either. "I need you to step aside while we handle this," she said, motioning toward the shop. Charlie knew he was being asked to step down to allow the status quo to continue, to let the entitled man's words stand, but Charlie wasn't going to give in. Not this time. "I'm not going anywhere," Charlie said firmly, meeting her gaze with unyielding confidence. "If this man can make demands based on his privilege, then I'm going to stand my ground. The system that allows him to get away with this needs to change, starting now." As the officer hesitated, Charlie's eyes moved to the man in the leather jacket standing just inside the cafe, his smug smile still plastered on his face. Charlie knew this was far from over. This moment, this decision, would set the tone for the rest of his fight, and the stakes had never been higher. The moment Charlie Mason stood face to face with the police officer, the stakes felt higher than ever. The crisp morning air bit at his skin, but his heart was warmer than ever, his resolve like iron. His mind was clear, despite the tension mounting in the background. The man in the leather jacket, standing just inside the coffee shop, was watching him intently, no doubt savoring the situation as it unfolded. Charlie knew exactly what was happening. The officer was here on someone's orders, no doubt an orchestrated move by the entitled man who now felt threatened by Charlie's words. The whole point of it was clear now: to make him feel small, to make him question his place in this world, and to remind him that no one had the right to challenge the established system. The system that allowed the man inside to get whatever he wanted, regardless of fairness or dignity. But Charlie wasn't about to back down. Not now. The officer's dilemma. The officer stood there, arms folded across her chest, staring at him with an expression that was both professional and calculating. Charlie didn't need to read her face to know what was going on in her mind. She was evaluating him, deciding whether or not to follow through on whatever order she had been given. Was she the kind of officer who would uphold the law impartially, or was she going to do what was expected of her? Serve the interests of the person with the power, the money, and the privilege? "Mr. Mason," she said, her voice clipped and cold. "We've had a complaint, you need to come with me. This doesn't have to escalate." Charlie held her gaze, his pulse steady. "What's the complaint?" His voice didn't waver, his eyes remained locked on hers, unblinking. "Disturbance," she replied, but there was no real conviction in her words. It wasn't a legal reason, it wasn't something he could easily be arrested for. But it was enough. The tension had clearly built to a point where she was expected to act, expected to push him back into his place, just like they'd all been conditioned to do for people who didn't fit into the mold. Charlie knew the drill. He had dealt with countless situations where the law was bent to protect the powerful and the privileged. He had witnessed it in boardrooms, courtrooms, even casual encounters on the street. But today, he was going to remind them that no one was above accountability, not the man in the coffee shop, not the officer, not anyone. "No," he said, his voice low but firm. "I'm not going anywhere." The officer's eyebrows furrowed, clearly caught off guard by his refusal. She hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing the consequences. It was the first time Charlie had seen someone second-guess their own authority. Maybe she wasn't fully aligned with the kind of power the man inside represented. Maybe there was still room for doubt. But the longer this standoff went on, the more Charlie could sense the rising pressure from all sides. He wasn't just facing the officer, he was up against an entire system that protected privilege at the expense of justice. Charlie stood tall, his posture unyielding. "I'm not breaking the law, I'm exercising my right to stand up for dignity. You'll have to arrest me if you want me to move." The officer blinked, clearly taken aback by the calm certainty in Charlie's voice, but just as quickly, her stance shifted. She wasn't here to fight him, not yet at least. The weight of her decision was still in the air, but the pressure was mounting. She exhaled sharply, as if considering his words. "I don't want to escalate this," she said, her voice slightly softer now. "But if you don't come with me, I'll have no choice." Charlie's resolve hardened. This wasn't the first time he had been threatened, but this time, the situation felt different. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the coffee shop on him. The man in the leather jacket, the manager, the barista, even the other patrons who were silently watching this confrontation unfold. The stakes were rising. "I'm not going to let you intimidate me," Charlie said, his voice quiet, but cutting through the tension in the air. "You want me to leave, I'm not going anywhere. But I'm sure you know how this looks." The support of the silent majority. At that moment, something unexpected happened. Emma, the barista, who had been quiet the entire time, stepped forward. Her face was flushed, but there was determination in her eyes. She looked at Charlie first, then at the officer, before speaking up. "He's not causing trouble," Emma said, her voice more steady than it had been before. "He's just speaking up. We've all seen what's going on here, and no one deserves to be treated like that, not him, not anyone." Charlie glanced at Emma. She wasn't the most outspoken person, but she had clearly recognized the injustice unfolding. The man in the leather jacket had caused enough of a stir with his entitled behavior, and now, Even the smallest act of resistance felt like a win. The officer's gaze flickered toward Emma. There was a brief moment of hesitation before the officer turned back to Charlie. "Do you really want to make this difficult?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. Charlie held her gaze, unwavering. "I'm not the one making it difficult. This is on you. You can either do your job and stand with fairness, or you can back down like everyone else who turns a blind eye." The man in the leather jacket's final move. The man in the leather jacket, sensing the shift in power, finally stepped forward, his eyes narrowed and his jaw tight. He approached the officer and placed a hand on her shoulder. His fingers dug into her uniform, a sign of ownership, of control. He was used to making people bend to his will. "Officer," he said, his tone dripping with condescension, "this man is clearly disrupting my peace. If you don't handle it, I'll be forced to take my business elsewhere. I'm sure the owner would appreciate knowing that." Charlie's eyes flashed with anger, but he didn't move. He could feel the contempt in the man's voice, the sense of entitlement that spilled out of every word. The officer glanced back at Charlie, then at the man, her expression unreadable. The weight of the decision was still there. Charlie could feel the internal struggle in her. She was being torn between two worlds, one that demanded her to uphold the law impartially, and another that expected her to cater to the whims of the privileged. She was caught in a game she had no control over, but Charlie knew that if she allowed the man to continue wielding power like this, it wouldn't just be this situation that would suffer, it would be the entire fabric of the justice system. The decision that would change everything. The tension in the air reached a fever pitch. Charlie could see the officer's hesitation. She was stuck in the same power play, the same unspoken biases that had dictated too many of his own interactions. But the choice was clear now. She could either align with the system that upheld inequality, or make a stand. For a brief moment, everything seemed suspended in time. The officer's eyes flickering from Charlie to the man in the leather jacket. Then, with a sharp breath, the officer took a step back. The man in the leather jacket faltered, his eyes wide in disbelief. "I'm not doing this," the officer said, her voice firm now. "I'm not arresting anyone, you need to leave." Charlie felt a surge of victory, small, but significant. The officer had made her choice, and the man's power had been defied. But it was far from over. Charlie knew the battle was just beginning. The man in the leather jacket, humiliated and enraged, would be back. And Charlie wasn't about to let the moment slip into oblivion. He would fight for every person who had ever been ignored, belittled, or cast aside because of their race or status. As the man stormed out of the coffee shop, Charlie's thoughts raced. This was just one skirmish in a much larger war. But it was a start. Charlie Mason stood outside Java and Jams, his hands firmly in his pockets, as the tension from the coffee shop settled in the air. The man in the leather jacket had stormed off, humiliated but not defeated. He had made his power play, tried to bend the rules to his will, and for a moment, Charlie had defied him. But Charlie knew this was only a temporary victory. The larger battle was still raging, and it wasn't over yet. The man's departure wasn't the end. It was only a pause in the conflict that was about to unfold. The morning light glinted off the street, and the world seemed unusually still. The city was waking up, oblivious to the quiet stand Charlie had just made, but he could feel the storm brewing inside him. His resolve had solidified. This was the moment when he would no longer just stand by. He had been patient. He had chosen his words carefully. But now, the time for subtlety was over. The system that protected people, like the man in the leather jacket, the unspoken privileges that governed their every interaction, needed to be exposed for what it was. As he turned to head back into the cafe, the door opened, and the officer, the same officer who had hesitated before, stepped outside. Her eyes were set, no longer uncertain. Charlie could see the shift in her demeanor. Whatever conflict had been brewing inside her had come to a conclusion. She had chosen her side, and it was time for Charlie to choose his. "Mr. Mason," the officer said, her voice calm but laced with something unreadable. "You need to leave." Charlie didn't flinch. He had expected this, though not from her. He had thought the man in the leather jacket would return, dragging the situation back into a power struggle, but instead, it was the officer who had come to finish what he started. "No," Charlie replied, his voice unwavering. "I'm not leaving. Not until this situation is addressed. Not until what happened in there is made right." The officer's jaw clenched, her posture tightening as she took a step closer. "You're making this difficult, Mason. I've warned you." "I don't need you to warn me," Charlie said, his tone sharp, cutting through the air between them. "I'm not the one making things difficult. The one making things difficult is the man who thinks he can walk in here and treat people however he wants, just because of the color of his skin and the money in his pocket." The officer's face flushed with anger, but Charlie saw the flicker of something else behind her eyes: hesitation. She was stuck in the same place she had been earlier, torn between doing what she knew was right and upholding the system that, for too long, had allowed the privileged to wield their power unchecked. She wasn't just dealing with a situation here. She was grappling with the very notion of what justice meant, and whether she could uphold it when it went against the grain of the world she had grown accustomed to. The officer took another step forward, her hand resting on her gun holster as if to remind Charlie of the consequences. But Charlie wasn't intimidated. If anything, his stance only grew firmer, his gaze unyielding. "You're going to regret this," she said quietly, her voice tinged with the weight of authority. "You're making enemies you don't want." Charlie paused, considering her words. There was a time when he would have hesitated, second-guessed himself. But today wasn't one of those days. Today, he was making a stand, no longer for himself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, ignored, or trampled under the weight of a biased system. He had learned to play by their rules, to climb the ladder, to win. But this moment, this was about something else entirely. "Maybe," Charlie said, his voice steady, "but I'd rather make a few enemies who stand for what's right than sit back and let people like him destroy everything we've worked for." The officer opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the door to the cafe swung open, and the manager, now looking even more nervous than before, stepped out. Behind him stood the man in the leather jacket, his face red with anger, his posture bristling with aggression. Charlie turned to face him. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the unsaid words that hung between them. The man had lost his initial composure, and now, all that was left was a simmering fury. "Let's make one thing clear, Mason," the man said, his voice low and threatening. "You don't belong here. You don't fit in. You don't have the right to challenge me. You think you're above me. You're nothing but an obstacle, a mistake waiting to happen. Do you understand me?" Charlie's pulse quickened, but his voice remained calm. "I understand that you're used to getting your way, but that's the problem. People like you think they can push everyone around them. You're so used to using your power that you've forgotten what it's like to be treated as an equal." The man's eyes narrowed. "Equal? What do you know about equality?" He laughed bitterly, the sound grating in the quiet space between them. "You're just a black man trying to play in a world that doesn't want you. I've seen people like you come and go, always trying to force their way into places they don't belong, and in the end, they always lose." Charlie stepped forward, meeting the man's gaze with an unwavering intensity. "You think you've won, just because you've been given everything, that your wealth, your position, your status, give you some kind of moral high ground, that you can define who belongs and who doesn't." He shook his head slowly. "You're wrong. It's not about money, it's not about status, it's about treating people with dignity, and that's something you've forgotten." The revelation. The man's face twisted with fury, and for a moment, Charlie thought he might lunge at him. But instead, the man stood still, his fists clenched at his sides. His entire demeanor shifted, and in the quiet, Charlie could feel the weight of the words that were about to come. "You don't get it, do you?" the man said, his voice suddenly quieter, almost menacing. "This isn't about dignity, it's about power. I have power. I don't care about your moral high ground, your speeches, your fights for equality. You can stand there and pretend you're some kind of hero, but the truth is, people like you, people who don't belong, will never win. You're just a footnote in the world that I control." Charlie's heart skipped a beat. The man wasn't just talking about power, he was talking about something far more sinister. He wasn't just trying to intimidate Charlie, he was revealing the truth that lay behind all of this. This wasn't about fairness or justice, It was about the unshakable belief that the powerful could always control the narrative, could always suppress those who dared to challenge them. Charlie felt the weight of the revelation sink into his chest, but it only strengthened his resolve. This was it. This was the moment he had been preparing for. He had to take a stand, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been dismissed, who had ever been made to feel like they didn't matter, for everyone who had ever been made to feel invisible. "I'm not going anywhere," Charlie said, his voice calm but firm, his eyes locked on the man's. "And I'm not backing down." High stakes. The man's eyes flickered, with something almost like fear now, and Charlie could see the tension in his body. The stakes had been raised. This wasn't just a fight over one coffee shop. This was about something much bigger. It was about a system that had been designed to protect the privileged, to keep people like Charlie in their place, and it was about to change. "I'll make you regret this," the man spat, his voice full of venom. Charlie's response was simple, but it carried the weight of everything he had fought for. "No, you'll regret underestimating me." As the man turned, storming back into the cafe, Charlie knew the real fight was just beginning. The man's anger wasn't just about him, it was about the fact that Charlie had dared to challenge a world that told him people like him didn't belong. But Charlie wasn't backing down, he was just getting started. Charlie Mason stood in the middle of the coffee shop, the world around him fading into a blur. The man in the leather jacket had stormed off, but Charlie could still feel the weight of his words in the air. The officer's presence had amplified the injustice, but now that the confrontation was coming to a head, there was no turning back. He had pushed against the system before, fought it tooth and nail in the courtroom, but this was different. It was personal. A voice pulled him from his thoughts. "You think you've won, don't you?" Charlie turned slowly, meeting the eyes of the man in the leather jacket, who had come back through the door. The rage was still evident in his posture. He was angry, but there was something else beneath it, something far more insidious. It was the cold realization that he could no longer hide behind his wealth, his privilege, and his power, and Charlie could see it, clear as day. The mask had slipped. Charlie's resolve hardened. "No," he said, his voice steady but filled with quiet strength. "But I've made sure you know you're not untouchable." The man's lips curled into a sneer. "You don't know anything about me, Mason. You have no idea what's at stake here." Charlie could feel the weight of his words. This wasn't just about a coffee shop confrontation anymore. It was about everything. The privilege that the man carried, the system that had allowed him to believe he could act with impunity, and the power he'd been able to wield without question. All of it was coming to a head, and Charlie had been a part of something much bigger than himself. This wasn't just his fight. It was for every person who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or silenced by a system that cared more about the color of their skin than their worth as a human being. The man moved closer now, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I've seen your kind come and go. You think you can make a difference, but you're nothing, nothing more than a token, trying to play in a world that doesn't want you." Charlie's chest tightened, but he didn't flinch. This was it. The moment when his patience, his composure, and his strength would be tested. His father's words echoed in his mind, a memory from a childhood spent learning how to navigate a world that often didn't want him to succeed. "People like me?" Charlie said, his voice cool and unwavering. "You don't get it. You think this is about me? You think I'm some exception? Some token?" He shook his head. "You're wrong. I'm not a mistake waiting to happen. I'm a man who has earned everything I've achieved, and that includes the right to stand up to people like you." The man's face flushed with anger, his fists clenching as he took a step toward Charlie. But Charlie held his ground, unfazed by the looming presence in front of him. "I didn't come here to argue with you," Charlie said, his voice firm. "I came here to remind you that people like you don't get to dictate who belongs and who doesn't. You don't get to use your money, your power, or your status to destroy others." The man laughed bitterly. "You really think you've got what it takes, don't you? You've got no idea how deep this goes, how far I've come. You think you're going to challenge me, challenge people like me. You're just one man, and you're nothing. You're just a token in a system built to protect people like me." Revelation. There it was, the revelation. The man's true intentions, his true nature, had been exposed for all to see. It wasn't just about power, it wasn't just about wealth. It was about something much deeper, an underlying belief that he, and people like him, were inherently superior. The layers of privilege, entitlement, and systemic corruption had been revealed with one careless sentence. Charlie had known it all along, but hearing the words confirmed everything. The man didn't just believe in his own superiority. He truly thought the system existed to keep people like him on top, because they were meant to be. Charlie had seen it in courtrooms, in boardrooms, and in his own life. It wasn't new, but hearing it spoken aloud made the stakes feel real in a way that it never had before. "You think you control everything," Charlie said quietly, his eyes narrowing. "You think that because of the color of your skin, the money in your bank account, and the name you carry, you can do whatever you want. But you're wrong. That system you think you control is broken, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." The man's smile faltered for a moment. For the first time, Charlie saw a hint of fear flicker in his eyes. Fear not of Charlie, but of the reality that he could no longer hide behind his mask. The system that had protected him, that had shielded him from consequence, was beginning to unravel. And in that moment, Charlie understood something critical. This wasn't just about him facing off against one individual. It was about fighting for every person who had ever been denied justice, every person who had been crushed under the weight of a corrupt system. The man stepped back, taking a deep breath, clearly trying to regain his composure. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he said, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. "I have resources, I have people. This isn't over." Charlie didn't flinch. "It is over," he said. "And if you think I'm the only one who sees this, you're mistaken. You've made an example of yourself, and now people are watching, they're seeing who you really are." Protagonist's strength. Charlie stood tall, his posture unyielding, his eyes sharp and clear. He had always known that moments like this were inevitable. The higher you climbed, the more dangerous the fall. But he had never let the system dictate his worth. He had built his empire by doing things the right way, by fighting for what was fair, by using his legal expertise to change lives. Now, he was standing on the edge of a precipice, ready to make sure the fight didn't end here. His pulse quickened, but he remained calm. He had trained for moments like this, his entire life. Moments where the odds were stacked against him. Moments where the people around him underestimated his ability to make a real difference. But Charlie knew the power of strategy. He knew the value of patience. And most of all, he knew that the truth always found its way to the surface. "Do you think people like you will always get away with it?" Charlie asked, his voice low, his words heavy with the weight of the truth. "You might have power today, but that power is built on lies, on systems that were designed to keep people like me out. And no matter how much you push, no matter how many resources you throw at this, it won't change what's coming. The tide is turning." The man stared at him, eyes narrowed, the color draining from his face. His earlier confidence was gone. For the first time, he realized that Charlie wasn't just a threat to his ego. Charlie was a threat to everything he had worked so hard to protect. "You're delusional," the man spat. "You think you can change anything, you're just one person, you'll never win." Charlie didn't respond immediately. He took a slow breath, letting the words sink in. "It only takes one person to start the change," he said finally, his voice firm. "But it takes many to finish it." High stakes. The tension in the room had reached its peak. Charlie could feel it, could feel the weight of his words, the anger in the man's posture, the scrutiny of every single person in the cafe, watching, waiting. This wasn't just a confrontation between two men. It was a confrontation between systems, between power and fairness, between privilege and dignity. And the stakes were higher than ever. If Charlie backed down now, if he allowed the system to continue unchecked, he knew that nothing would change. He would be no better than everyone who had let things like this slide for years, who had been too afraid to speak up. But if he stood his ground, if he kept pushing, then maybe, just maybe, he could change something. He could show the world that people like him, people who had been pushed aside, had the power to fight back. That his voice, his actions mattered. Charlie's heart pounded in his chest as he stared down the man, his resolve stronger than ever. This wasn't just a personal battle, it was a fight for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. And in this moment, Charlie knew that the only way to win was to keep going, no matter the cost. The unresolved moment. The man in the leather jacket stood motionless, his chest rising and falling with each breath, his eyes still locked on Charlie. He looked like a man on the edge of a precipice, his sense of superiority crumbling, his belief in the system that had upheld him for so long shattered. And then, with a sudden motion, the man turned and stormed out of the cafe, slamming the door behind him. But even as the door closed, Charlie knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. The real fight was just beginning to take shape. Charlie stood in the middle of the coffee shop, his body tense, his mind racing. He had won this round, but the battle was far from over. There were still many walls to tear down, still so much more to be done. The uncertainty hung in the air like a cloud, but Charlie wasn't afraid. He had taken the first step, and he would take the next. The storm had passed, but its echoes lingered. Charlie Mason stood alone in Java and Jams, his back to the door that had just slammed behind the man in the leather jacket. The tension in the room had subsided, but the silence left an emptiness in its wake. Charlie wasn't sure if he felt victorious or exhausted. He had just stood his ground, and in a way, he'd won. But victories were rarely clean, and he could already hear the whispers of what would come next. The officer who had threatened to arrest him stood off to the side, arms crossed, a contemplative look on her face. She hadn't left yet, hadn't made any move to escalate the situation further. Charlie's stance remained firm, but there was a faint weariness behind his eyes. This wasn't the first time he'd faced injustice, but this confrontation felt different. This time, it wasn't just his own reputation on the line. It was about something much bigger, something that needed to be addressed, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or silenced. The man's words still echoed in his mind. "You're just a token in a system built to protect people like me." They were the words of someone who had never known the sting of real consequence, who had never experienced the brutal weight of being judged by something as immutable as skin color. They were the words of someone who thought his privilege was untouchable. But Charlie had just proved that it wasn't. Conflict resolution, the aftermath. The days that followed were a whirlwind of media coverage and legal scrutiny. The man in the leather jacket had tried to save face, but his actions hadn't gone unnoticed. Charlie wasn't sure what had become of him, whether he had slinked away, embarrassed, or whether he was still trying to rally his resources against Charlie's growing momentum. But the man had lost something far more important than his temper. He had lost his credibility. The police officer, whose hesitation had played a pivotal role in the moment, had stepped back. But the consequences of her actions were undeniable. As news of the encounter spread, it became clear that her reluctance to act had sparked a series of conversations about authority and the role of law enforcement in perpetuating biases. There was a shift in how people saw her, not as a mere enforcer of the law, but as a symbol of a system that, when pushed, could be questioned. She had done what Charlie had been asking for all along. She had made a stand, and it had cost her her blind loyalty to the system. A few days later, Charlie received a call from the officer. Her voice was measured, but there was a hint of something he hadn't heard before: respect. "I want to apologize," she said, "for what happened, and for the way I responded. You were right. I was more focused on keeping the peace than on what was actually happening, and for that, I'm sorry." Charlie paused, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. He had never expected an apology, certainly not from someone so embedded in a system that rewarded compliance and passivity. But here it was. "I appreciate that," Charlie said, his voice calm but knowing. "I think we all have a part to play in this. We just have to make sure that we're doing the right thing, even when it's hard, even when it's uncomfortable." There was a long silence on the line, but when she spoke again, her tone was more resolute. "I want to do better. I want to be part of the change, not just someone who upholds the status quo. I've started reaching out to some community leaders, trying to understand how I can help move things forward." Charlie nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "That's all we can do. Move forward and do what's right, even when it's hard." Protagonist's growth. The confrontation at Java and Jams had been the catalyst for something deeper inside Charlie. He had always known that his power came not just from his wealth or his position, but from the responsibility he held to speak out when it mattered. But this moment, this confrontation with the man who thought he could control everything, had solidified something in Charlie. He was no longer just fighting for himself. He was fighting for a future where people like him, people of color, people whose voices had often been silenced, could step into any space without the fear of being judged or dismissed. He was fighting for a world where no one had to prove they belonged, where systems of power were held accountable for the harm they caused. The next few weeks were a blur. News outlets picked up the story, and Charlie's word started to spread. His social media accounts, which had always been quiet and professional, exploded with messages of support, anger, and frustration from people who had seen this happen to them too many times. For every positive message he received, there were a dozen others from people who had been in Charlie's position, people who had been overlooked, belittled, or forced to fight for their dignity in spaces where they should have been treated as equals. Charlie had never been one to seek the spotlight, but he knew the responsibility that came with it. He began speaking out more, using his platform to advocate for systemic change, to highlight the stories of those who had been ignored, and slowly, other voices joined his, voices that had been quieted for too long, voices that were finally being heard. Systemic change. As the weeks passed, Charlie's fight for justice began to take on new dimensions. He was invited to speak at forums on racial justice, to share his experiences in boardrooms and community centers alike. He was no longer just a successful lawyer. He had become a symbol of the power of resilience, a beacon for those who had been told their voices didn't matter. In the midst of it all, something unexpected happened. One of the corporations Charlie had been negotiating with reached out to him, offering to partner on a new initiative aimed at addressing inequality in the legal system. It wasn't just about corporate responsibility. It was about a real, tangible shift in the way businesses, organizations, and institutions thought about their role in perpetuating biases. The same corporation that had once been hesitant to engage with Charlie, whose own policies had been scrutinized, was now actively asking for his input on reforming practices that had long overlooked marginalized communities. Charlie couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. This was the beginning of a larger movement, a change that had been set into motion by one decision, a decision that had come in the face of adversity, when the odds seemed too high, when everything seemed to be stacked against him. But now, the world was watching. Emotional closure. Charlie stood outside Java and Jams again a few weeks later, the same street corner where everything had begun. The world around him was changing, and he had played a part in it. He wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to stop fighting. The weather had cleared, the sun shining down on the city, but Charlie's mind was still racing with everything that had transpired. The man in the leather jacket had faded into the background of the story, but the lessons Charlie had learned from that day would stay with him forever. He had learned that the real fight wasn't just about changing minds, it was about changing systems. It was about finding the courage to stand firm, even when the weight of the world seemed unbearable. And even as he looked back on the chaos of the past few weeks, he knew the work wasn't done. There was more to be done, more change to be fought for. But for the first time in a long time, Charlie felt a sense of peace. He was part of something bigger than himself, something that was just beginning to unfold. Setting up future possibilities. Charlie's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he glanced down to see a message from Mitchell, a close friend and fellow activist who had been helping him navigate this journey. "We're ready for the next step, let's make this official." Charlie smiled. The next phase of the fight had already begun. There were still battles to be fought, but now, Charlie had allies, real, powerful allies, who were just as determined as he was to change the world. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, Charlie felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The fight for justice had only just begun, but he wasn't alone. And that, in itself, was the most powerful victory of all. As Charlie Mason walked through the doors of his office in the weeks following the confrontation at Java and Jams, he felt a sense of clarity he hadn't known before. He had stood at the precipice of a moment that could have crushed him, but instead, it had been the catalyst for something much larger. The moment when he confronted the man in the leather jacket had not just been about a coffee shop dispute. It had been a microcosm of everything he had ever fought against: the entitlement, the inequality, the systems that kept people like him on the sidelines. But that moment had also been a turning point, one that pushed him to take a stand, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, diminished, or invisible. In that moment, Charlie had taken a stand for the values he held dear: fairness, equality, and respect. He had learned that the fight for justice wasn't something that happened in isolated instances. It was a constant, ongoing struggle that required resilience, courage, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Closing the protagonist's arc. When Charlie had first walked into Java and Jams, he had simply wanted a cup of coffee and a quiet moment to himself. But that moment had shifted into something far more significant. It had started as a chance encounter, but it had evolved into a confrontation with the very foundations of the power structures that existed in his world. Charlie had faced countless challenges in his life. He had fought his way to the top, overcoming every obstacle that had been placed in his path. Yet, the battle that unfolded in the coffee shop was different. It was personal, emotional, and above all, necessary. The man in the leather jacket had been a representative of everything Charlie had battled against throughout his life: the systemic biases, the racial prejudice, and the unchecked power that came with wealth and privilege. But Charlie didn't back down. He didn't fold when faced with the kind of anger and entitlement that came from a man who had lived his life believing that his power could control the world around him. What Charlie realized in that moment, what had crystallized for him as the confrontation unfolded, was that he no longer had to prove himself. He didn't need to play by the rules that others had set for him. Charlie had spent too much time trying to fit in, trying to prove that he belonged in spaces where he was made to feel like an outsider. But now, he understood that true strength came from standing firm in his identity, accepting who he was, and knowing that his worth had never been in question, even if others tried to make him believe it. It wasn't just about the one altercation. It was about everything that had led up to it. All the ways he had been treated differently because of the color of his skin, all the ways the system had tried to push him aside. The victory wasn't in winning the confrontation. It was in the realization that he had the power to change things. And with that understanding came a sense of responsibility. Charlie wasn't just a successful businessman or lawyer. He was a voice for those who had been silenced. He had the platform to effect change, and he was going to use it. Broader implications. Systemic change. The story that had unfolded within the walls of Java and Jams was more than just about one man's entitlement. It was a reflection of something larger, a microcosm of the systemic issues that pervaded society: the prejudice, the biases, the ingrained notions of who belonged where, and who was allowed to have a voice. They were present in every part of society. The fight wasn't just about standing up to one individual. It was about challenging an entire system that had been built on the backs of those who had been marginalized. Charlie's stand against the entitled man was a small but significant action in a much larger struggle. It wasn't just a protest, it was a call to action, a reminder that systems of power and privilege had consequences. For years, people had been told that the world worked a certain way, that wealth and status could shield you from accountability. But Charlie had shown that power could be questioned, that even the strongest walls could be broken, if only someone was willing to challenge them. The conversations that followed, the apologies, the outreach, the media coverage, became part of a larger movement. The shift in public opinion was undeniable. People began to talk about the biases that had shaped their interactions. They began to reflect on the way they treated others, whether it was in the workplace, in casual encounters, or even in the places where they felt most comfortable. Charlie had sparked something, and while he couldn't change everything at once, he had taken the first step. His actions had pushed the issue into the public eye, and for the first time, it felt like real change was within reach. In the weeks that followed, Charlie became involved in initiatives that aimed at addressing inequality, not just in his field, but in the broader community. He worked with organizations that sought to bring diversity and inclusion to industries that had long been dominated by the privileged few. He advocated for reforms in the legal system, pushing for policies that would ensure fairness for all, regardless of their background or the color of their skin. He didn't just talk about change. He worked tirelessly to make it happen. Inspiration for the audience. Charlie's story was one of resilience, but it was also a story of hope. It was a reminder that while the fight for justice might seem like an impossible task, progress was possible. Every small victory mattered. Every person who stood up against injustice contributed to the larger movement for equality. Charlie's determination to fight back, to stand firm in the face of adversity, was something that anyone could relate to. He wasn't a superhero. He wasn't someone who was above the fray. He was just a man who had faced the same struggles as countless others. But what set him apart was his refusal to back down, his refusal to let the system dictate who he was or what he could achieve. As Charlie spoke more publicly about his experiences, more people began to feel empowered. They saw in him a reflection of their own struggles and realized that they didn't have to be passive observers. They could take action, no matter how small, and work toward a future that was fairer for all. Charlie's fight wasn't just his own. It was a collective fight, one that invited others to join in, to speak out, and to demand better for themselves and their communities. The fight was far from over. There were still many battles to be fought, many walls to be torn down, but Charlie had learned an invaluable lesson. Change didn't have to come all at once. It could begin with one person standing up, one voice speaking out, and as more voices joined in, the collective power of those voices would eventually break through the systems that had long kept them down. Emotional impact. Closure and moving forward. As Charlie stood in his office, gazing out the window at the city skyline, he felt a sense of peace. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, and there were still countless challenges to overcome. But in the quiet moments of reflection, he realized something that had become clearer than ever. The fight for justice was never truly over. It was ongoing, and while the path wasn't always smooth, it was worth walking. Charlie had changed. He had grown in ways he never expected, and he had learned that sometimes the greatest victories came not from defeating an enemy, but from recognizing the power within yourself to make a difference. He knew the battle against prejudice and inequality would never be fully won overnight, but the seeds had been planted. His actions had sparked something. And no matter how difficult the road ahead was, Charlie Mason was ready to continue the fight. The world was changing, slowly but surely, and with each person who stood up, with each step taken toward justice, the future grew a little brighter. The future. As Charlie stepped away from the window and turned back to his desk, a small smile played on his lips. There was work to be done, yes, but Charlie was no longer standing alone. He had allies, people who shared his vision and who were ready to carry the torch forward. Together, they would continue the fight, and maybe, just maybe, the world would start to look a little different. For now, that was enough.